Hello, welcome to Universally Challenged, the podcast that offers cultural criticism from a biblical perspective. This week we discuss why do bad things happen to good people? Is God really in control? And then we take a few minutes to discuss student loan forgiveness. So please sit back, relax, and ready yourself to be challenged. This week we're going to talk about why do bad things happen to good people.
First off, wasn't there a book written by Rabbi Kushner that was actually titled that?
Probably. I mean, it's a common question. Yeah.
Pretty much know what I'm going to say. That from a biblical perspective, there are no good people.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Are there good people, I think, was the question to answer. And I think you hit on it, that the biblical standpoint is there are no good people. Romans 3:10-18. This is a paraphrase, by the way, guys. Nobody try to stone me over this one. It talks about how there is none righteous, not even one. There is none who seeks God. There is none who does good, not even one. Ecclesiastes 7:20. There is not a righteous man on earth who continually does good and never sins. In 1 John 1:8, if we say we are without sin, we are deceiving ourselves and the truth is not in us. Jesus said in Luke 18:19, no one is good but God. In Genesis 6:5, the Lord saw every intent, the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. And of course, after the flood, when he promised not to flood the world again to kill man, he even said that he wouldn't flood it, but he said man's heart is evil from his youth. So, I mean, these are clear statements in the Bible that there is no good person. I mean, that's where I think we need to start there.
Yeah, and I certainly would agree with that. And you can take it even back. Let's look at the cross. If you ever had an issue with God allowing bad things, or God allowing evil, once again, think of what probably is the most evil act, the crucifixion of the only innocent man that's ever walked the face of the earth.
Yeah.
It doesn't get more evil than that.
See, you're too smart. You're jumping way ahead of me.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You understand it, and so it's very simple to you. And I wrote down this whole trail leading to that conclusion. Ultimately, that's going to be our ultimate conclusion. The worst thing ever happened to the best person ever. I think the question that most people ask, though, is if God's all powerful and God's all good, then why does evil happen? Because we've already established there are no good people, but if there is a good God who has the power to stop evil and he doesn't stop it, that makes him evil. And if he doesn't have the power to stop it and he's all good, he's not all powerful. And that's kind of what the atheists or the agnostics would say. And I was listening to Vodi Bakum talk about it, and he said that he would go onto college campuses, and he said it's always a first-year philosophy student that would approach him with this question, using big terminology, and he'd ask him, are you a first-year philosophy student? He said they would say yes. He said his rule is, if you've only had 1 year of philosophy, you can't talk about philosophy. Now, he said, no philosophy experience, talk about it all day long.
Right.
More than 1 year, talk about it. He said the one semester, he said, don't talk about it. And he would tell them that I can't answer this question because it's posed wrong. And his big deal was, he said, the way the question should be posed is, how can a righteous and holy God, knowing my thoughts and my deeds from yesterday, let me live through the night till this morning? He said that's really how it works. It's not that we're good people that deserve good things from God. I think we both agree that we deserve wrath and not mercy. And that's what makes mercy so great, right? Yes. Yeah. There's nothing in us that, is desirable to God, basically.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you have a lot of Christians, me and you in the past have gone back and forth on, Calvinism versus Arminianism versus whatever other ism you have.
Yeah.
But when you think about evil and how it deals with God directly and its presence, for some Arminians, it just makes their head start spinning around.
Yeah.
Because they don't know how to answer the question, and their two best responses are either limiting God's power or limiting his knowledge. And why would you go there? I sleep well at night knowing that God is in control of evil. It's there because he triumphs over it. And to me, it took a long time to really understand that, because even as a young Christian, I did have a problem with that. But once I was allowed to see its purpose was for his ultimate glory, that makes a whole lot of difference in how you go about
Yeah, see, you can only have one or the other. Either God's in control of evil or evil's in control of God. And that's the bottom line on that. Because either God's going around and doing his best to put out all the fires that we're starting. And just that's all the best he can do. You know, and open theists believe that God doesn't know the future, and he's just hoping you'll make the good decisions, and he's waiting for us to decide what to do so that he can, you know, come in and try to put out our fires, you know.
Kind of like he's learning on the job.
Yeah, he's learning. It's like he's not all-knowing, you know. But some people may say he's not. If you're listening to this, and I don't know if anybody is, but if you're listening to this and you disagree with me on that, let me know and we'll have a conversation about it. Because to me that's an interesting conversation. Something I wanted to talk about a little bit earlier when we established that there are no good people, but evil does still exist. We all agree evil exists. Is what types of evil there are in the world. And I was watching John MacArthur. He has a very good thing on the problem with evil. If you ever want to watch his sermon on that, it's pretty great. And he says there's 4 types of evil. And he said there is natural evil, hurricanes, disease, you know, things of that nature. Moral evil, which is the evil that man creates that comes out of our heart. Supernatural evil. The Bible clearly points out that we're fighting not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and the prince of the power of the air. So that's clear in the Bible. And then he said there's everlasting evil. And he said that's contained in hell. And it'll be there forever. Which I would have never put that in the category. But I guess if you're going to say that hell is everlasting, that it is definitely there forever. That it'll be only evil in hell for sure. If God is in complete control of evil, like we talked about earlier, do you agree that God's sovereign?
Yes.
Do you have a working definition for sovereign in your own mind?
I think we've gone over this before, and I hope I use this to my definition of sovereign. But I believe it's the attribute that allows God to be God, in a sense. Now, to elaborate on that, sovereignty basically explains that God has the authority, has the power to control, maintain everything from the minutest of atoms or molecules or whatever the tiniest thing is to the universe itself.
Yeah, and that's what, talking about it last week, we were talking about the Brittany Griner situation, her being in jail in Russia. If you think of it from a nation standpoint, Russia's a sovereign nation. They decide what the rules are within their borders. Right. And when you're there, they get to do with you as they please. And God has, I thought of it, the simple definition I ended up writing down, that he's in complete control of his creation. You know, R.C. Sproul said there is no rogue molecule in the universe. And that's what you were just talking about. And we don't think about, you know, we think about him being in charge of the large things, the earth, the stars, you know, the sun, all those things. But we don't think about even down to the smallest, you know, atom that God's controlling it. You know, nothing happens by accident in that area. Someone once said that a raindrop doesn't fall in any place that God doesn't allow it to fall. You know, that's how it's not just sitting there like, I'm going to throw some rain over there. He knows where the drops are hitting, you know, and that's pretty crazy. I have some verses to establish God's sovereignty here. And I pretty much stole these. I'm giving credit here. Pretty much stole these from John MacArthur.
You got any from Job in there?
I got some from Job. Right. Got some from Job. We have to put up with me trying to read my own handwriting here. Psalms 115:3. Our God is in the heavens, and he does all that he pleases. Daniel 4:35. And this is... I believe this is when Nebuchadnezzar was in the field and he looked up to heaven and he made a proclamation of who God was, and he came out of the field. He was, you know, turned into a beast or whatever, the field. He was the most powerful ruler of his day, and this is what he had to say about God. He said, all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of the heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand and say, what have you done? Okay. Deuteronomy 32:39. See now that I am he, and there is no God besides me. I put to death and give life. I have wounded, and it is I who heal, and there is no one who can deliver from my hand. Exodus 4:11. The Lord said to him, who made man's mouth? Who makes him mute, or deaf, or seeing, or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Psalms 10:5-16. God called for a famine on the land.
Well, I'm going to jump in real quick. I like how the conversation's going because it started in the right spot and it's heading in the right direction, because I think everybody right at this point in time that would listen can kind of see this tying into the sovereignty of God. That's a main point.
Oh yeah, this is pretty much what John MacArthur's point was in these verses, and I'm going to read a few more just to keep kicking a dead horse. I think this is pretty established that God does as He pleases, and that nothing happens that He does not will to happen. It's that He is in control of evil, and you don't have to let God off the hook. He was saying some men try to get God off the hook, and they want to point out, oh no, but God didn't do that. God wouldn't throw somebody in hell. God wouldn't do, what I'm talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
But he said God does not let Himself off the hook. He said He brought a famine.
Yeah.
He did this. He didn't say, well, Satan brought the famine and I did my best. That doesn't happen. And if you're worshiping that type God, you're worshiping a weak God. You would be in fear at all times.
Yeah.
He sustains the universe. He sustains me. And I know one day He's not going to sustain me anymore. I deserve to die being born into sin. I'll die, but I know I'm stepping out of this life into the next life whenever God chooses, and that's just how it's going to happen.
Well, and what's the blessed hope of heaven?
Yeah.
If you can't trust God now, why would you think heaven would be any different?
No.
What's in it for the Christian if that's the case?
Oh yeah, I totally agree. In 2 Kings 17:25, they didn't fear the Lord, therefore the Lord sent lions and killed some of them. Okay, that's one of those hard verses we talk about that they would normally pull out of the Bible to make it more palatable, but that's there. Lamentations 3:37-38. Is it not from the mouth of the Most High both good and ill come forth? In Job 23:13, what his soul desires he does, speaking of God. Psalms 103:19. The Lord has prepared His throne in the heavens, and His kingdom rules over all. Isaiah 46:9-10. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not yet been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. We got Amos 3:6. If there is calamity in the city, will not have the Lord done it? Isaiah 45:7. I am the Lord, there is no other, forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am the Lord who does all of these.
I like thinking about Job, and I can't compare myself to Job because the Bible tells us he was truly a righteous man. So I'm not going to go there. However, I do understand crying out to God and saying, why are you letting this happen? Why are you doing this? Making suggestions that I somehow could have done better. And I love the way that God, and I can't remember what chapter it is, God responds to Job and basically puts him in his place rather quickly.
I believe it's 38-42.
Very sternly, and just says, Job, who are you?
Yeah.
Where were you at when the world was created?
Yeah.
Who made this? Who did that?
He said, I told the waters to go here and no further. I stretched out the sky. Where did I sink its pillars? He was very sarcastic from God. But you're right, he put Job in his place there. And that was the thing I was actually going to bring up is there were a couple of people in the Bible that if you want to do quotation marks, good people, you could say Job, you could say Joseph. I think both of those were people that they were sinners like everybody else, but the Bible pointed them out as being righteous men. And God even suggested Job to Satan.
Right.
And why would He do it if it didn't bring him glory through how Job handled the situation? That
Right.
Job would not, turn from God. He would not curse God and die. And he knew when he did that. And to us, you can look at it, some people would say, well, God's evil because He killed His children. First of all, Satan did all those things. God allowed him to do it. But He did allow him to do it. But the point of it is that it does glorify God. And Joseph, too, we can talk about him a little bit. We all know that his brothers were jealous of him, sold him into slavery. Well, they were going to kill him. They put him in a pit. They end up, a few of them fish him out, sell him off, and he goes to Egypt. He's enslaved, but God promotes him up to be pretty much equal with Pharaoh. And God gives him the ability to save the whole land. He takes his dad Israel, brings all his children to Egypt, saves their lives from the famine, and that's how the Israelites got to Egypt. Moses came about, the moving of the people out, the promised land.
Right.
Everything that happened points to Christ.
Yes.
It all led from there to Christ. So a super evil situation where these brothers are jealous of their other brother because he's blessed turns into Jesus. It was God's plan from the beginning. It's pretty amazing. I don't think people look at the Bible as an overall story sometimes that tells a story of God and his redemption for man. And they look at his individual stories and they don't piece all that stuff together sometimes. But Joseph's brothers, when they found out that he was in control in Egypt and he had them contained, they thought, he's going to kill us.
Yeah.
And they knew they deserved to be killed. This was a revenge story. I always call this story the Count of Monte Cristo. It is, man.
Yeah.
In the Count of Monte Cristo, all these horrible, unjust things happen to this man. And at the end, he gets to come back and have his revenge on everybody. And that's what you would expect in this situation. And all of us would cheer if he got his revenge on them.
Well, sure.
And he threw them in jail and he imprisoned them. He took all their stuff. But he told them, he said, why are you afraid? He said, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And I think that's an important thing here, is that men do have evil intentions. There is moral evil. Just because God allows it, some would say he ordains evil because it happens. And I really can't disagree with that, because if he didn't allow it to happen, it wouldn't happen. But God has intentions in that evil. His intentions are good. Joseph's brothers' intentions are bad. So same actions, both have intentions in those actions. God intended for that to happen for good. His brothers intended bad. So John MacArthur would point out in one of his sermons that the Bible's clear that God is absolutely sovereign.
Right.
As we've established earlier, but man is absolutely responsible for what he does. And as we know, one of the verses we read said, who answers back to God?
Right.
And in Romans, same thing, Romans 9, the objector says, well, if God chose these things, then why are we responsible? And he says, who are you, O man, who answers the one who created it?
Yeah.
And that's stated several times. It doesn't really say, it just like, hey, why are you even asking this question? You're not in the place to ask this question.
It's based on the presumption,
Yes.
Like we talked about, the Bible is very unapologetically declares a theocracy.
Yes.
It starts out from that premise. So there's no question to be answered about, certain things. It automatically says, okay, God, now let's explain some stuff.
Well, that's what, I can't remember if it's R.C. Sproul or John MacArthur had pointed out, that if we didn't live in America, we wouldn't have a problem with some of the things that are said in the Bible about, God being king, being ruler, being in charge. Yes, because we're Americans. I didn't have a say in that.
That's
I get a say in this. You ain't doing that without asking me. You know what I'm talking about? He said, you grow up in one of these countries with feudal lords and kings and emperors and stuff, you understand they have sovereign power, and you come before them. They don't even have to be just in their decisions they make towards you. God is just. The problem is we don't want his justice. Because his justice leads to hell. We want his mercy. And that's what we would hope for anybody listening to this, that you seek the mercy of God and that you trust in Jesus, and you don't rebel against God and go to hell, because your response, even though I've said God is sovereign over everything that happens, you're still responsible, as we talked about. Do you have anything you want to add here? I've got just a couple of closing.
The only thing, and it's kind of related to the topic, since you brought up Joseph, and we could also bring in Paul, even though Paul had a past, but after his conversion, he was certainly a man that had some bad things happen to him. One thing that I struggle with, and I think if every Christian is honest with themselves, they can say the same thing, is when we do go through bad experiences and bad times, when we get treated wrongly, when we are abused by family, friends, or others, how are we handling it? Are we doing it like Joseph, that says, okay, how do I see Christ? How do I find God in this situation? Or are we trying to take revenge on other people? Are we trying to handle it our own way? And that's my struggle. So my prayer for anyone out there if you're going through something like that, or the next time you do, bring it to God and just say, God, what are you wanting me to learn from this situation, and how can I let others see Christ through me in this? So,
yeah. Oh, I totally agree. And you think about how Christians in other countries handle these situations. They're in jail for what they believe. Yeah. North Korea, a lot of these Muslim countries, you hear about these unjust imprisonments. You hear about them taking Christians' daughters that are like 12 years old and just marrying them, stealing them from the house. You would feel like there is no justice. But these people are still Christians. They still hold to the hope, that's beyond this world. This is not where our hope lies, is with us, And speaking on, as we talked about earlier, I would say that evil is ordained by God. Not that God creates evil. He does not create evil, but he created man and allowed evil, ultimately for the purpose of Christ and the most wonderful thing that ever happened. The problem is we see people as good and we think everybody should go to heaven. But I think if you really think about it, most people don't want to be rubbing elbows with Adolf Hitler in heaven. You know what I'm talking about? No, There's been true evil on this earth, and that it deserves justice. But that's a totally different conversation. I don't want to chase a rabbit there. But the fact that the greatest evil ever, as you talked about earlier, that man's ever created was ordained by God, and that was Jesus on the cross. And then we have a couple of verses in Acts that point that out. And this is Peter talking, and he says, "This man delivered over by the predestined plan and foreknowledge of God of you was nailed to the cross by the hands of godless man and put him to death." And then Acts 4:27, Peter's also talking, and he says, "In this city there gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you appointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur." So, and that lays, and he's ultimately saying that Jesus' blood was on everybody's hands. It was on the people in power from Rome. It was on the people in power in that region. It was on the Gentiles' hands, and it was on the Jews' hands. Some people want to put Jesus' death on the Jews alone. He's saying it was on all of them, but he's also saying that this was the purpose of God, and it was predestined to occur. So this is God ordaining evil for good. And that's how God uses evil, And I don't think some of the verses we read earlier, I don't think he tries to hide from the fact that when these things happen, that he's in control of them. I know some people want to blame Satan for everything. Satan is real. Satan is a devouring lion, all those things. But he's on a leash. Mm-hmm. He's not up there competing with God, and God's like, Satan got me this time.
Right.
That ain't happening. He knows he has a limited time to do as much damage as he can. That's what he's trying to do.
Exactly.
Okay. Any final notes on this subject?
Also, I like to make note of some things that do happen to us, where, Paul had the experience where, since God knew, being Paul, being Scooter, being Zach, that we got too much of a good thing. We get the big head, and we start thinking it's all about us. Well, God gave a thorn in his flesh, basically an agent from Satan, to keep him humble. Yeah. And the Bible even says that Paul prayed not once, not twice, but 3 times for God to take it away from him.
Paul, who was healing other people, couldn't heal himself.
And God basically said, hey, look, through your weakness, I'm going to show my strength, and it will be sufficient.
I've often wondered what that thorn was. It never really tells us, but I assume with all the beatings and stonings and stuff that he took, it probably had something to do with related to something physical. From
nagging injury.
Yeah, I would think so. Maybe he was partially blind, anything. They thought he was dead before. They've hauled him out of the city and left him out. They thought he was dead. And he got up the next day and was preaching the gospel, And if God didn't, that glorifies how great God is, that Paul, they try to kill me. I'm going to try to crawl off in the desert somewhere and try to find a caravan to take me home. Paul got up and it's like, he understood that God ordained that beating he just took. And it glorified God that much more for him to go back in. I'm sure people were saved based on what he did, So something bad happens, glorifies God again. Yeah. I think that's where we're going to wrap this one up. Okay. You were talking about not to get too political here. I didn't really even look it up, but Scooter was telling me in yesterday's news today. Don't have a radio voice, but that's what you're getting. that the student loan forgiveness that the Biden administration's come out with.
Yeah, so it really hasn't been put into action. It's basically more just what's come out of his mouth so far. Nothing has gone before Congress. I haven't looked into a whole lot of it, but I've heard some of the bickering back and forth about the president doesn't have the right to cancel loan debt, but then the senator says some act back in 1965 says that they do have the right. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I was just wanting to know your personal opinion on, is it a good idea, is it a bad idea, and why?
As someone who still has some student loan debt, I'm like, yes, please forgive it and then make it illegal. No. The problem is that you're not canceling debt. You're transferring the debt.
That's true.
And the government still is going to pay those loans because those companies are not going to go away without getting paid. You can't just say, oh, they don't owe you anything anymore. And they're probably not even going to pay them everything that they're due. So they're kind of stealing from those companies. You had adults that went into contracts and wrote down saying, you give me this money and I will pay this money back. That debt should not be passed on to me or you. That's just my opinion on it. I think it's a little bit of a socialist move, and socialism is not Christianity. It's theft. Yes. You're forcibly taking money from one group and giving it to another group. And in Christianity, we give money, but we give money out of, what we want to give, out of the goodness of our hearts. We don't have goodness. I know I said that earlier, but, out of whatever generosity God gives us, we give. And socialism is, I'm going to take what you get by gunpoint because I'm the federal government and I wield a gun, right, and I'm going to transfer it to this other person who's irresponsible.
Yeah, wasn't it? Now, somebody out there, please look this up because I'm not guaranteeing you what's coming out of my mouth is 100% accurate. But I believe Winston Churchill had a quote to the effect of, socialism is great until you run out of other people's money.
Yeah, that sounds like Winston Churchill, to be honest with you.
And it's so true. Yeah. But looking at it from some of the arguments against it, the time that we're at in the country, number one, if you do such a thing, nobody's going to, if I get my debt forgiven, you're probably not going to hear any complaint.
Yeah, that's kind of. I don't think it's wrong to take advantage of a program.
Sure.
If the government says, "Hey, we're selling electric cars and you can buy them for 65% off," take advantage of it. It's a law. You can take advantage of it. I don't agree with it because they're taking our money to make this thing happen. But
the problem is. My family and your family are kind of the same boat economically. Okay, we're not going to go into numbers, but 60% of the student loan holders in America make upwards of $75,000 plus. Yeah. Okay, so that leaves you with about 20 to 30,000 that hold a loan that are at or below the poverty line or somewhere below 35,000. Yeah. If you're going to do something for someone, why will we not address that particular population? I would love for it to be forgiven. I would take advantage of it. But like I said, I'm not real sure how you're helping out the the underserved portion of the United States. You're actually kind of giving a boost to those that are a little bit better off. And also, with the inflation we have going on, we don't need to be throwing extra money into the economy. That's the wrong thing. Right. That's one of the issues I had with the spending bill, what they call the Inflation Act or whatever he's calling now. This is not the time to be throwing money into the economy.
Yeah.
All you're going to do is drive the inflation up even
Inflation's
higher.
bad. Let's print more money and pump it out there. It does not help inflation to print more money.
Yeah, and you're just going to drive the cost of colleges up even more. So
it's a vote buying scheme is all it is. I mean, and you almost can't blame people that don't pay taxes because they don't see it. They're like, oh, well, those people got plenty. If they'll just give a little bit more, I can have these other things, but it's not right. It's just not. Work hard. This is America. You can move up. You have to put work in. We live in a society that has so much leisure that we just kids want to sit around and play video games until they're 35 years old. And that's just the truth. They want to live with their parents, not have any bills, and play video games. Yeah. That's all they want to do. And they don't realize in society past, when you were 11 years old, you were going to work with your dad, and in a couple of years, you might be supporting your own family, and that's just how it worked. And nowadays we live such cushy lives that we expect everything just to be given to us. People don't grow up anymore. It just doesn't happen. And I can say, being in my mid 40s, I think I was late. I mean, I was married when I was 21 years old, but I probably wasn't even an adult the way I acted. I can think of all the immature. Of course, I hope continually as I grow older that I mature and I look back on the things I did in the past and think how silly those things were. But, I'm not saying that I'm special and that I developed any faster than anybody else. I think we're all products of our society. And if we can't say other people are and say that we're excluded from that group. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
We're definitely affected by it.
I'm just worried. I texted you earlier. We were out shopping. We were doing grocery shopping for the next week. Angie and the kids had cheer the rest of the for 6 hours today. And at the store, out of butter, it's on my list. I go over to get butter. The same Bluebonnet tub of butter that I pay $3.39, not on sale, 3 weeks ago, is $6.19.
Oh no, it's crazy.
That's horrible.
I used to buy a tub of rotisserie chicken at Walmart, and I remember it was like $6.48, and I was thinking, man, this is getting too expensive to buy. I could eat a couple meals on it through a day when I was trying to eat healthy, and I saw that same stuff at Walmart the day I went over to get some. It was over $12. Doubled in price from a year or so. I mean, that's crazy. And I don't know how people are going to be able to afford to eat. They keep wanting to pay people more money, but they have to pay people more money so that you can live.
And that's what Angie says. She goes, I don't see how people that have minimum wage paying jobs make it. It's just...
Yeah. And then they'll say, oh, well, we need more government assistance. But then it just causes perpetuates the problem. We were talking about that the other day with my older daughter and about minimum wage and how you don't even really have to have a minimum wage, because whatever the market will bear, if people won't work for it if they can't afford to live by it. And if down at the local Dairy Queen, if they're not just going to pay you $2 an hour because the other place wants workers too, and they're going to say, no, we're paying you $5 over here, and then someone else is going to pay $8, and eventually you're going to find an equilibrium where people are willing to work for a certain amount of money, and that's kind of what they're going to pay. Nobody can go to work for $2 an hour and do anything in this economy. And even right now, minimum wage, I mean, they start those kids off up there at minimum wage. I think is still like $9 an hour. Don't get me wrong, I don't know for sure, but I think it's still like $9 an hour. And I don't know of a fast food place in town that starts out less than like $12.50 because people can't afford to work for that.
Yeah. Thank you for listening today. We really appreciate you supporting our program. And until next time, as always, keep styling and profiling. UCcast out.